Yes. Okay. Our guest today is Dr. John Hilton III. John is an assistant professor at Brigham Young University. John has a master's degree from Harvard and a PhD from BYU, both in education. John is the author or co-author of over 50 peer-reviewed articles and has a variety of research interests, including the processes of learning and teaching and the effects of OER, open educational resources. John and his wife Lanny have 6 children. So John's going to talk to us for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. John, shall you start?
Okay, well, thanks. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let me know if you're seeing this.
Got it.
Perfect. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about OER efficacy and perceptions of research. That's my main topic today, is what does the research say about OER? But maybe before I begin, I think if you're in this course, you probably understand why we care about OER to start out with. But just so that we're all on the same page, OER makes a huge difference in students' lives. Recently, I was reading a bunch of student comments, and the student comments were on the question of what would you spend your money on if you did not have to purchase textbooks? And one student wrote, my tires on my car were getting pretty bald, and I decided that I'd have to delay getting new tires to purchase textbooks. But then my teacher announced that we were going to have a free textbook. So I went out and got new tires for my car. A couple of weeks later, there was a heavy rainstorm, the student said, and I slammed on my brakes and was able to stop just in time before hitting a deer. Then she said, quote, OER literally saved my life, end quote. Now that's kind of a dramatic story, and I don't know that I would always say that OER is going to save people's lives, but it definitely makes a difference. For example, listen to this. This is an instructor from Sacramento City College named Jessica Coppola. She says, Sacramento City College has a large percentage of its student body who are below the poverty line. When I require students to spend $78 on a book, many of them simply cannot. Having a free textbook is a matter of equity. It's allowing low-income students to have an equal shot at earning a good grade. I had a young woman in my office today crying that she had to choose between feeding her children and buying books for school. Because of an OER, she doesn't have to pay for a book in my class. So there are real stories, and sometimes we start to talk about cost savings or open pedagogy, kind of big picture ideas, but I do think it's important to realize that at an individual student level, there's a huge difference in students' lives. Also, there's a difference, I think, in kind of an important factor in how students feel. In a recent survey, and this was across roughly 1,000 college students, we asked them at the very end of the survey if they had any additional comments they would like to share on textbook prices. 2% of the comments were positive. 8% of the comments were neutral, neither positive nor negative. And you might think, okay, wow, that means 90% are going to be negative. And what we found was there were about 56% that we categorized as negative, like new editions don't usually change enough to be worth the cost. But to our surprise, there was a large group, more than a third of students, whose comments we could only categorize as extremely negative, like this one. Textbooks are the biggest scam targeting the poorest demographic. Requiring specific editions is a gross abuse of power for monetary gain. I think it's important that we realize that there are, behind every textbook adoption, there's lots of stories. There's stories of how students use the money that they could save when OER has been put in place. There's stories of how the students feel as consumers of textbooks. And I think that those stories can maybe help us understand why we care a little bit about research into OER. I don't think anyone is opposed to saving students money. The concern, though, is if I use OER, will student success metrics like their grade in a class or their withdrawal rate or their final exam score, will these change if we use OER? In fact, a 2014 survey found that college professors rated proven efficacy and trusted quality as the top two most important criteria for selecting teaching resources. So a key way that we can determine whether OER has proven efficacy or trusted quality is through doing research. So there have been a couple of dozen studies, research studies performed on OER, and I want to talk about some of these stories. But first, let me maybe frame it with what we call the COO framework in the Open Educational Group. These are 4 different areas where we've done and others have done research on OER. So first is cost. Proponents of open textbooks, or OER more broadly, frequently claim that using OER instead of traditional publisher textbooks or online courses will save students money, both in post-secondary context and in a K-12 context. So that's an empirical question we can examine. There have been several studies that have looked at it and found that actually students both in K-12 and in higher education save large amounts of money when using OER. Outcomes, the O in the COO framework. So the idea is you get what you pay for, right? So how can student learning be just as good when you're using something that's free as something that costs $100? And we'll come back and look at this question here. Does the significant cost savings provided by OER correlate with meaningful changes in pass rate, final exam scores, or withdrawal rates? We'll come back to that question momentarily. The U in the COO framework has to do with how students and teachers use OER. Proponents of OER frequently claim that the permissions provided by open licenses allow students to use these materials in novel ways. For example, writing a new section based on current events for a modern history course. However, there's little evidence to date that students or teachers exercise these new permissions. So the U strand of the COO framework wants to examine evidence related to these claims. And so far, there's only been a couple of studies in this area. This is an area that's ripe for further research. The P in the COO framework, perceptions, is one that we'll focus on more today. And that is, what do students think about open textbooks and open educational resources? How do they judge their quality relative to traditional textbooks? Do they find the formats, structures, design easy to navigate, frustrating? What about teachers? What are their perceptions? What about parents, policymakers, other stakeholders? So the COO framework kind of gives us a broad way to think about different aspects of OER research. And I want to focus today on outcomes, or efficacy, and perceptions. And you can see there's a link here, openedgroup.org/review, if you want more details on some of the research studies. I'm just going to frame them sort of as stories. So the first story here is about the ChemWiki project. This is taking place in the University of California system, although it's available anywhere in the world. ChemWiki as a replacement for a traditional chemistry textbook. So here's the design of the story. On the one hand, we've got a general chemistry book, and the cost of this textbook is $290. There's 448 students in the class that are using this textbook. Students in another class are using ChemWiki instead. It's free. And you have about the same number of students, 478 in these classes. Now, what I like about this experiment is it's the same semester. You have the same teacher who gives the same lecture, gives the same homework, same TAs, same exams, and the two classes, these two sections are taught in back-to-back class periods. So a pretty neat way to take out any difference in teacher quality, for example. Same teacher, same lectures. In fact, the researchers also did a pre-test of students' chemistry knowledge before the semester started and found out that the two groups were in fact equivalent in their chemistry knowledge. So everything about the students in these two classes is the same. They know the same, they're getting the same lecture, same homework, same exams. One group is spending $130,000 on textbooks. The other group gets their textbook for free. And as you would probably suspect, the results are the same. Students did equally well on both midterm exams and final exam in the two sections. There's no difference. And so you could ask, what did the students who used the traditional textbook get for their additional $130,000 spent? And it does not seem from this study that they gained any more learning than students in the other class did. So that's one interesting OER research story. A second one has to do with students at about a dozen colleges who adopted OER. And there's lots of things in this particular study, but the one that I want to focus on, kind of a unique finding that they had in terms of student outcomes, had to do with the fact that students who used OER took 15% more credits than students who used traditional textbooks. So you can see both in the semester when they used OER in the fall and in the winter, students took statistically significant more classes when they used OER. And the researchers in this study hypothesized that students have a limited amount of money, and when they don't have to spend money on textbooks, they're able to reallocate money that would have been spent on textbooks for additional courses, because at many institutions, you pay per credit. And so if I have fewer credits, or if I have lower textbook costs, I can afford to take a few more credits as well. So that the outcome of this study, interestingly, would indicate that students may be able to graduate more quickly when using OER because they're taking more credits. Similarly, in this study, they also found that across 15 different classes, in 9 of the classes, there was no difference in the student pass rate. In 5 of the classes, students using OER, the treatment, did better than traditional, versus one control class, traditional textbooks did better than OER. So you could reasonably say that students were quite likely to do as well or better when using OER as opposed to traditional textbooks. Here's one more study, just a little kind of a story, I think, that comes from the Z degree program at Tidewater Community College. So in this case, they're trying to make it so that you can graduate with an associate's degree having only taken courses with 0 textbook costs. And the main kind of theoretical idea in this article has to do with the course throughput rate. So the course throughput rate here is the idea that there's lots of ways that students cannot pass the course. Maybe a student signs up but drops before the drop deadline. Or maybe a student takes the first few weeks of the course but then withdraws from the course before the withdrawal deadline. Or maybe the student's final grade isn't high enough to pass the class. So students can drop out of this filter at any point in time. And we wanted to examine whether students who used OER versus students who were using traditional resources had any differences in the drop, withdrawal, and final grade. So you can see here, this is for face-to-face classes, the drop, withdrawal, and C or better rates. In terms of, on the left-hand column is the traditional resources. The right-hand column of the funnel there is OER. So fewer students drop, fewer students withdraw, more students get a C or better when using OER. And when you combine the results of those 3 parts of the funnel, basically students are almost 7% more likely to pass a class, to get through these 3 successive hurdles when using OER as opposed to commercial textbooks. And similarly, a significant portion of students were in online versions of the course, so we looked at these 2 differently. You can see that students are less likely to drop, less likely to withdraw, and more likely to pass a class. And again, you have roughly a 6% improvement when using OER. So that's really significant. Students are more likely to successfully complete a class, and at the same time, they're saving lots of money. So we just kind of heard 3 stories here about a dozen institutions, thousands of students, and when using OER, students drop fewer courses, are less likely to withdraw, more likely to pass their classes, they take more classes, and save millions of dollars. So the research case for using OER is quite strong. Now, what about the other part? We've been focusing on the outcomes. We also mentioned perceptions was something that we would talk about. So again, there's a link to a website if you want to see more details on these research studies. I'll just highlight a couple. There have been about a dozen perception studies so far. One study here took place at Kansas State University, and they looked at university and students and faculty perceptions of OER. So they surveyed 524 students who were taking 13 different classes. They found that students reported using OER more than commercial textbooks. They found that students rated the OER as having good quality. And they also found that students preferred using OER to buying textbooks. And that one's probably not too much of a surprise. They interviewed 13 instructors, and 12 of the 13 said they preferred teaching their course with OER instead of a traditional textbook. Another study was done by the California OER Council, and they did several interviews and surveys with students and faculty members. 16 faculty shared their perceptions about OER, and they found that 7 of the 16 felt that the OER textbook was superior to the traditional textbook, and 5 rated the OER as being equivalent. So 3/4 of faculty said it was as good or better. I think it is important to note that there was one area of weakness, and that has to do with the ancillary or support materials like PowerPoint, test banks available with the OER textbooks. Half the faculty felt that the support materials lacked quality, and 25% felt that implementing the support materials took a significant amount of time. So this is an area where there's probably a little bit of room for improvement, and those who are advocating for OER or creating OER may need to put a little more time and attention into it. On the student side, 351 students completed a survey about their use of OER, and you can see that between the two larger parts of the graph, better and same, you have 81% of students say that the OER textbook is as good or better, with the largest group saying better than a commercial textbook. And interestingly enough, of the 351 students, 100% wanted to use OER textbooks in the future and would recommend the use of OER to their friends. So that means even those who perceived the OER to be of lower quality felt that the cost advantage was such that they would rather use OER in the future, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Now, just in the interest of time, I'm only telling a couple of these stories here, but if we were to look across multiple perception studies, we'd find that students prefer OER, faculty prefer OER, and OER helps students. So looking across the 14 peer-reviewed studies of perceptions of OER quality, just roughly skimming across all of them, they've covered 6,050 professors and students. And a general finding across these studies is that 50% say that the OER are about the same quality, 35% say it's better, 15% say that it's worse. Again, aggregating, we only looked at 3 stories, but if we were to look at the 13 peer-reviewed studies of efficacy that have been done, cover about 120,000 students, 95% of the time, students achieve the same or better outcomes. Altogether, I believe that these are pretty robust findings, and I want to just leave you with a few sources for further study. If you want to read or link to all of these research studies, openedgroup.org/review is a great place to go. If you're interested in conducting your own OER research and would like to learn a little bit more about methodologies or approaches, maybe read more about the COO framework, openedgroup.org/toolkit is a little pamphlet that we've put together on conducting OER research. And then finally, if you look at openedgroup.org/openpedagogy, you'll find some ideas for engaging with the use permissions. And as we said at the beginning, most of the research that's been done to date has been done on cost, outcomes, and perception. But OER is not just about saving money. There are great opportunities in terms of opening up our pedagogy and using the open licensing provisions, both as students and as faculty. And that's an area where we're interested in doing more research, and so you can see some of our thoughts there. And this is probably a good place for me to stop sharing and just ask if there's any questions that you'd like to offer.
Yeah, I actually do have a couple questions. First, I'm really appreciative of your Open Ed Group website. I think the work that you're doing is really, really important. And it makes me wonder, do you know of any similar sorts of research on the efficacy of traditional commercial textbooks? I guess we've always just assumed that they were effective.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are studies that have been done comparing two other curricula with each other. So for example, this commercial product with that commercial product. Those have largely been done at the K-12 level. And it's really interesting that across, so there have been more than 100 studies that have been done. But when you look at the What Works Clearinghouse, which has a very high bar for educational research, they're not able to say with very much clarity what commercial textbooks are the best. And that's really interesting to me. There is not a clear research study that shows across rigorous peer-reviewed studies, X textbook is the best textbook for teaching psychology or economics or whatever it may be. I think especially in higher ed, there's been largely an assumption that, yeah, this is going to work and be good.
Now, that's a great segue into my second question. And I ask this quite seriously. Maybe textbooks don't matter. Have you given thought to that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That's an argument that I've heard is maybe the reason why you're not seeing that a huge improvement is no one's reading the textbooks anyways. I haven't actually seen someone do a study where they did, control group used the traditional textbook, treatment group had no textbook. That'd be a fascinating study.
Yeah, I think I'd be afraid of what we might find out.
Yeah, that is possibly true.
If you look at student behaviors, and in yesterday's session, we had a student in and we were asking her, and I know this has come up in other student discussions. A lot of students seem to think that textbooks are substitutes for going to class. They're not complements. Now, I don't know, I hope that's not true, but they're certainly acting that way. Maybe, well, let me just tell you what I think. I think that having a textbook matters, especially in my classes and especially for sort of analytical things, analytical subjects. But maybe which textbook you have doesn't matter that much because they all provide sort of the right baseline of content for the students.
That seems reasonable to me. I mean, that's a testable hypothesis.
Yes, it is.
What we've sort of seen, which is swapping out a textbook doesn't make a huge difference. The difference, I think, really comes at cost. If there's a $100 textbook versus a free textbook and I'm getting the same educational outcomes, then it's probably worth investigating because the cost savings are so significant.
So why do you think so relatively few faculty have adopted open textbooks? Do you think it's not being aware of what the options are, or what?
I think part of it is lack of awareness. And my guess is a large part of it is inertia. Although I think you're starting to see us get closer and closer to a tipping point. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I heard at a conference recently, Rich from OpenStax, the CEO of OpenStax, was talking about pretty large adoption levels of their biology and physics textbooks. I think there will get to be a point when probably the real tipping point happens when I, as a faculty member, notice students aren't enrolling in my class as much as they used to, and I go to Professor Smith down the hall and say, hey, your class has a wait list. What's going on? We teach at the same time, and I've got good ratings. Professor Smith says, I'm using this free textbook. You should check it out. And then all of a sudden, you start to realize, wow, maybe there's something to this.
I hope you're right. I hope you're right. Well, John, thank you for your time. I know we got a little bit of a late start, so let's call it a day. And
Hey, thank you.
thank you
Great to
again.
be with you.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Bye.